Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob here, and today's guest is Eric O'Neill. Eric's career began in the FBI's counterintelligence trenches as an undercover operative. His undercover work brought down Robert Hanssen, the most notorious and damaging spy in United States history. Since then, Eric has spent decades as a national security attorney, corporate investigator, and national cybersecurity strategist. Additionally, he's the best-selling author of Gray Day and the inspiration for the film Breach. Eric, it's truly a pleasure to have you on. Maybe to kind of kick things off, it'd be great for the audience, though most of them very likely know the story, of what transpired. What led you to uncovering what was happening with Robert Hanssen?
Yeah, certainly, Rob, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's good to be here. I'm happy to talk a little bit about, I guess, my origin story, at least what brought me onto the scene, gave me a little claim to fame and a voice that some people listen to. Robert Hanssen was the most damaging spy in FBI history and quite possibly in U.S. history. Over 22 years, that's over 2 decades of espionage. He meticulously undermined the intelligence community in the United States' ability to do counterintelligence. So that's the science of stopping spies and espionage. And he did it by giving up some of the most damaging secrets that have ever been given to a foreign power directly to the Soviet Union. And he spied so long, he continued and gave them to the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He gave up everything from our nuclear warfare program to the continuity of government program to undercover operatives who relied on that cover to keep safe and keep working, to all of our spies working in Russia during the height of the Cold War. We lost every single asset there. And he shares those with a CIA spy named Aldrich Ames. And he gave it up for very little. He gave arguably billions of dollars worth of information for just a few million. And part of that was to keep him from getting caught. So how do I come onto the scene? Because this legendary spy had been operating as the most deeply placed mole in the intelligence community for 22 years. At the very end of his career in 2000, December 2000, before he was going to retire, a former KGB intelligence officer gave us a slim envelope of information that pointed to Hanssen. Now, it was pretty circumstantial. It wasn't enough to arrest him for anything more than maybe conspiracy to commit espionage. So the FBI decided to build a case, a better mousetrap. So they promoted him to executive service. They brought him back to headquarters. They gave him a office with his own office and then a pit area where I sat. And they put him in charge of information assurance, which today we call cybersecurity. So think about that for a minute, because the other thing you need to know about Hanssen is he wasn't just the most damaging spy. He was our first cyber spy. He meticulously stole information from computer systems for all those years. He actually dropped data in floppy disks in packages under a bridge in Vienna, Virginia, so that his intelligence officer buddies from the Russian embassy could go pick it up. And they put him in charge of building cybersecurity. So they gave him his dream job, everything he wanted, access to information, and they found apparently the only person who knew how to catch a spy and turn a computer on in the room with him to not only watch him and make sure he wasn't stealing secrets, but talk to him and learn about him and confirm, one, that he was the spy that we were after for over 2 decades. And then once I managed to do that, find out the secrets and information that were going to lead to his arrest. In other words, they asked me to go in undercover as myself in FBI headquarters, a case that was the most unique case the FBI ever ran, and find a smoking gun that would lead to the arrest of the most notorious spy in U.S. history. And I managed to do it.
And you did it. You did it. It's unbelievable. It's just a great story. And I purposely, obviously, wanted to have you share that at the onset before we get into more of the cyber specific, because it does set the foundation, as you mentioned, right? It was the kind of beginning of cybersecurity in that role that he tapped into, but it's the connection points of what you were able to accomplish and how you tie that back into spying with then looking at the cybersecurity realm and how you've continued to evolve your career. So I want to obviously focus our attention on that. And, you know, we recently had Craig Jones, who's the former head of the cybercrimes division within Interpol, on talking about, you know, all the different types of cybercrime that obviously has been seen globally. The great work the team there has done in putting together a collaboration of close to 200 countries to really kind of focus in, but again, keyword collaborate with one another as best possible, let's say, dealing with all these different types of organizations and the country kind of elements that come into play, geopolitical and so on. What I want to tie that back into, though, is the evolution of kind of how you've built this career on the foundation of really the counterintelligence aspects, spying, and how they interconnect into what you've seen with cyber-specific issues. And kind of that story, if you will, on your transition to being very focused in this space as you've been for many years now.
Certainly. My background in the FBI was to be an FBI ghost. So my job was to go undercover. I was fully undercover my entire career. The Hanssen case was unique in that I was still undercover just as myself. I wasn't even known by my name throughout most of the FBI. I had a code name that was used to refer to me. That's how deep cover I was. And the majority of what I did was counterintelligence tactics that are taught in the FBI. I had to learn the tradecraft of all my adversaries. And when you work in Washington, D.C., which is the espionage capital of the world, we call it the spy capital of the world. I mean, everyone is here. Everybody's spying on the U.S., and they're all spying on each other because every country has some presence in Washington, D.C. And my squad would run around trying to track all of them. So in order to do that, in counterintelligence, you have to know how to think like a spy. And then you have to learn how to act like a spy hunter, how to defeat all of the intelligence goals of your adversary. The other half of what I did was counterterrorism, which is very similar. That's just the science of stopping terrorists. And you deploy the same methods in order to stop the terrorists before they do what they plan to do. And the concern in Washington, D.C. Was obviously that they would try to blow something up. Mm-hmm. So here the basis of my career was in that science of stopping spies, the techniques and tactics of a spy hunter. And as I moved through the Hanssen case, and we were working on actually building cybersecurity for the FBI, which was our overt job. My covert job was catch them, but overtly we were actually had to do the work. Nobody at headquarters, except for a handful of people, knew that this was an investigation. I started to learn a lot about how to better protect systems. And I realized at some point in my career, this is after becoming a national security attorney and starting to be a public speaker, and then a more well-known public speaker on main stages, talking about first the Hanssen case and then talking about cybersecurity, that there was a new way to think about cybersecurity and not just stopping an attacker, which, 10 years ago, everyone was focused on a single attacker. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do was focus not on that, but major threat groups. So I was one of the first people to start talking about not thinking about some cyber attacker, a single person. I like to use the image of some kid in a hoodie in a basement typing away at a computer and hits one key and says, "I'm in." It's like, that's magic. That's not actual cyber attacks. What I wanted everyone to do, and this has been my platform, is elevate your thinking about cyber attacks. These are sophisticated attack groups, and some of the most egregious and damaging cyber attacks come from espionage groups, because espionage groups from countries who want to do us harm have had to evolve. Now, recruiting a Robert Hanssen as a mole is far more complicated a process than just launching a sophisticated cyber attack against a government agency, taking the username and password and credentials of an individual that you want to use within the agency and then puppeting them throughout the data, right? In other words, creating what I call a virtual trust insider. I'm stealing credentials and using them to infiltrate systems. So cyber espionage has evolved. Espionage itself has evolved. It's all cyber now. And my ideas and thought leadership have been to take all those lessons in counterintelligence and apply them to not just cyber espionage, but more and more today, cyber crime.
Yeah. I think it's the level of sophistication, as you were just describing, is what it's all about. And that's part of a lot of the conversations that we try to have also on the podcast, is thinking differently as to how the attackers as a group, as a whole, like what are they actually going after? What are the reasons behind it? So it's just a different, complete approach than what people have thought about in the past. I'd love to get your perspective on some of the more common TTPs that you're seeing relative to cyber spying, how they actually maintain the persistence, how they cover their tracks. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, like I just said a moment ago, Rob, they espionage has evolved, but it still uses the same tactics. So the number one tactic that a spy will use, and by the way, when I'm talking about espionage, you can apply all of this to cybercrime. The cybercrime syndicates that have formed, sometimes they're called crime gangs on the dark web. I like to call them syndicates because it elevates the way you think about them. I have just modeled the best in the business spies. So the only real difference is the goal of espionage is to infiltrate, quietly steal, maintain persistence, and not get caught.
Yeah.
Whereas criminals will do all the same things, same tactics and techniques, except for at the end of it, they smash and grab.
Yeah.
They exfiltrate. They want you to know. They want you to know they're there. They lock it with ransomware, malware, and they want you to buy your data back, right? Whereas spies would love it if you never knew they were there ever. So what are they doing? They're using the same deceptive tactics that espionage has used since biblical times. I mean, it's the oldest profession on earth. They're getting someone to trust something that they shouldn't trust. They're fooling a individual, a person, into letting them in. Most successful espionage attacks are using the same attacks that occur against every business and individual on earth. Spear phishing is still the number one vector of launching an attack. If you can completely fool someone into letting you in the door rather than trying to pick a lock, that is the way that attackers will always launch their attacks. But espionage is getting incredibly clever. If you looked at what happened during the SolarWinds breach, that was Russian espionage at its best. Learning everything they could about a company that provides a networking tool to many of the Fortune 500s, but I think their primary target was government agencies, everything from Department of Homeland Security to other major Treasury and other major agencies in the US were using a particular networking tool that the company was providing, SolarWinds was providing. And so they spent months just doing what's called reconnaissance, the same way you would set up on a target that you want to infiltrate at some point, like a physical building. You're going to watch it for a long time, learn everything about it. They understood intrinsically how SolarWinds went about doing their update process and were able to insert themselves into the update process between the quality control. So, a company will take an update, kind of check it out of the library where it's secure, modify the update, add to it, and then check it back in and issue it. And in that short little point where they were modifying and updating and checking it back in, the Russians were able to intercept it, recode it. And then when this legitimate update was sent out by the company to all its customers, it was essentially a Trojan horse that infected them with code that allowed what's called a beacon back to the Russian intelligence officers, and they could quietly start looking at whoever was compromised, going through their data and seeing what they wanted to steal. One of the difficult things about it is anyone who was compromised could have had their data stolen or not. You don't know, because spies are crafty that way. And, those techniques will continue as long as there are nations in the world. There will be espionage. There will always be spies.
No, that's for sure. No question about that. Do you see similarities, kind of call out any differences as well between the SolarWinds attack and also Kaseya? I think we talked a little bit about this previously. You and I, you explained to me kind of a different perspective that opened up my eyes, and I think it'd be interesting for you to kind of share again that thought process that you walk through in looking at those two different attacks.
Yeah, certainly. Kaseya is sort of the natural next step in the evolution of not just espionage but cybercrime, because it was a very similar attack by a Russian cybercrime group this time, right? Modeling, I think, looking at what worked with SolarWinds is a little different in how they were able to infiltrate. But once again, they were able to alter an update that came out from the company to its clients, and everyone who installed it was locked with ransomware. And of course, you're going to do an update. I bang the drum all the time. One of the most critical things that any individual consumer or business or enterprise, government agency, whoever can do is stay on top of updates. Those updates are incredibly important, because if you don't update, I mean, like, just look at your phone, look at your computer. If you're not updating critical problems, if you're not installing those critical patches, then you're leaving it open for a vulnerability that now all the bad guys know about. Because they will launch attacks within 48 hours of learning that there's an update of a critical vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So here, of course, everyone updates. That's what you're supposed to do. But then that update causes all of these customers to be locked with ransomware. And now there's a very clever cybercrime gang goes back to Kaseya and says, if you give us $70 million, we'll give you the master key that you can send to all of your customers who have been locked and unlock them all at once. Or they can go one by one and just be really angry at you. Kaseya ended up not paying. The FBI was involved. They flooded the dark web. They were able to get a lot of the keys. They were able to use a third-party company that was able to create a decryptor. But it was an enormous amount of time and effort. I think at the end of the day, they did the right thing, because we don't want to pay cyber criminals. If at all possible, paying that ransom means that they now have more money to scale operations, line their pockets, hire more bad guys. And it encourages other people to join the cybercrime business, which is one of the fastest growing businesses on earth. But that's very similar in, two cases, very similar attacks. Yep. One is spies and one is cyber criminals. And it demonstrates the incredible sophistication of cybercrime.
It definitely does demonstrate that for a fact. And I think it was like a view of lessons learned and how they could take advantage of, again, one versus the other for much more elevated type of attack at the nation state level, for example.
Certainly. And, one other thing I wanted to add here, Rob, is when we're looking at techniques that spies use, you have surveillance and you have counter surveillance. And when I was working undercover, maybe following it, just say at the most basic level, an individual suspected of espionage down the street, right? A very highly trained Russian, let's say. And they're using all their tactics to try to spot surveillance. And we're using all our tactics to make sure that we're complete ghosts and are never seen. Or if we're seen, it's like 3 different disguises or that sort of thing. But spies can use what's called counter surveillance as well. That intelligence officer may be so operating at such a high level at that point that there is a team of other individuals who are watching them and seeing if anybody else is watching that person. So counter surveillance is also used in cybersecurity, and spies use this all the time. They will use different code to look at the system and try to spot cybersecurity and evade it. And cyber criminals are doing this as well. And AI has made this easier, because AI can continue to do this and persist in doing it. And it doesn't have to sleep or take breaks or get something to eat. So AI is very much changing the game and how these infiltrations occur.
Very true. We've talked about the unfortunate kind of consequences of AI from continuing to accelerate the bad guys and some of their capabilities, and us kind of trying to continue to catch up. But I think you call it a really key example of, again, where it's being seen in this counterintelligence type of view. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for all the great work you've done to help, obviously, our worlds that we live in within the U.S. specifically, and also everything that you're doing to continue to help promote and educate everyone globally on the way to think differently to go after the adversary. Thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, Rob, it's been my pleasure.
Hello, Producer Ben here, and I just thought you'd like to know that Eric's going to be back on the show again next week. Rob's going to be getting his thoughts on the vulnerability of US critical infrastructure to cyber attacks from nation states, the threat of combined cyber and kinetic attacks, the role of deception in cybercrime, and Eric's forthcoming book, The Invisible Threat. So do remember to subscribe or follow Reimagining Cyber so you can listen as soon as it's available.